as well. So much of this is, there's a lot that will overlap from what you learned in 7th grade, because if you remember back then, we talked about parts of the heart and so forth, but we'll get into some more detail in this section. So obviously in the human heart, there are 4 chambers. There's 2 atria, 2 ventricles. Atria are the receiving chambers, chambers where blood enters the heart. The ventricles are the pumping chambers, the chambers that then squeeze that blood out. And blood gets pumped from the heart through arteries. We'll be talking more about arteries and veins later on, but arteries carry the blood away from the heart. So leaving the heart are a variety of arteries that lead to all of the various parts of the body. The heart is surrounded by a sort of tough membrane. It's called the pericardium. Helps protect the heart. Also is sort of filled with some fluid. It's flexible, it stretches, it shrinks. And that helps to reduce the friction on the heart. Okay, helps sort of lubricate the heart, because heart is a muscle that has to work very hard and constantly be able to contract and relax to keep us alive. The heart's made of a special type of muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue. And also within the heart, between the chambers, are a variety of valves. And those valves are important. Those valves ensure that blood only flows in the proper direction. And they help maintain pressure. So the valves, there's several types, and sometimes they go by different names. But there's the tricuspid valve. Okay. If you look at the heart, you see the sort of overall motion of blood entering in the atria, moving into the ventricles, and then getting pumped out. And these little doors here, those are the valves. And they separate, they prevent blood from going the wrong way, prevent backflow of blood. Okay? They also maintain pressure. Okay? So between the right atrium and the right ventricle is a valve that's called the tricuspid valve. Okay? Prevents blood from going backwards, going from the right ventricle into the right atrium. Only allows it to go in one direction. At the base of the aorta, and also where the pulmonary arteries leave the heart, there are another type of valve called the semilunar valves. Again, allow blood to leave the heart but not come back into it. And then there is another valve called the bicuspid valve, sometimes called the mitral valve, in which the left atrium and left ventricle are separated from each other. So all these different valves just make sure that blood only flows in a single direction. Sophia?
On the right atrium and ventricle, why is it blue if it's getting oxygen?
What's that?
Why is the vein that's going in blue and the artery, why is the artery coming out with blue?
This one?
Yeah, that's oxygen.
It doesn't. So this blood, we'll get into the circulation, but this blood came from where?
The body.
Yeah, all the different parts of the body. And where is it headed?
The lungs.
Yeah, this is headed to the lungs.
Oh.
So that blood, that's the only artery that carries deoxygenated blood.
Oh,
So most arteries carry oxygenated blood except for this pulmonary
And then
artery.
the left is going back into the heart and then out to the body.
Yes. Yep. So again, if we just look at this, some more detail here. These valves, they open and close. Show you, I'll pass around this heart. And if you open up, you can see the.
Maybe you used to have like a sheep brain or a sheep.
I still have sheep heart. I'll show you that sometime. So if you open up, you can see the valves in there. And this, they're sort of in white, and you can see the different valves. So again, if we look here, you have the tricuspid valve on the right side of the heart, okay? As the blood goes from the right atrium through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. Then it gets pumped out through a semilunar valve that's called the pulmonary valve. As blood comes back into the heart, goes into the left atrium through this mitral valve or bicuspid valve. into the left ventricle, okay, and then gets pumped out through another semilunar valve called the aortic valve, okay, and then out into the aorta. And those valves should close and seal up very well. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes people have abnormalities in their heart valves. If you have a heart murmur, you may have heard that. It's pretty common. Sometimes some blood leaks or those valves don't close properly, and there is a little bit of backflow that you can hear when you listen to somebody's heart using a stethoscope. That's a heart murmur sometimes. Sometimes heart valves need to have surgery to repair them. There are artificial heart valves that if a person's heart valves aren't functioning properly, they can be replaced with plastic and metal valves that fulfill the same function. So it's fairly common. And this diagram here just shows that sac that surrounds the heart, that pericardium, that helps protect and lubricate the heart. You know, sometimes people with heart disease have swelling inside of that, or fluid builds up, and there's sort of inside of that pericardium and swells, constricting their heart as well. So if we look at the human heart, the right side of the heart is the side of the heart that receives deoxygenated blood from various parts of the body, and then pumps that blood out to the lungs. The left side of the heart is responsible for taking in that oxygenated blood and then pumping it out to various parts of the body.
So the only reason it has to go back to the heart from the lungs is to get pumped?
Yeah. And you know, if you remember, other types of vertebrates, like fish, for example, have only a two-chambered heart. And in a fish, blood that comes from the gills, that's oxygenated, gets mixed with blood that came from the body, which is deoxygenated. So there's mixing of those two types of blood, and it's not as efficient. A four-chambered heart, where oxygenated blood is kept completely separate from deoxygenated blood, is the most efficient at delivering oxygen to the cells. But the heart is a muscle, obviously, that requires a lot of energy, okay? And so it needs its own supply of blood. You might think, well, if the heart is filled with blood, it doesn't probably need any more blood, but it does. It doesn't actually get oxygen from that blood inside of it. It has its own supply of blood through the cardiac arteries, okay? They're often called coronary arteries. And what you see is, this is the aorta that's pumping oxygenated blood out. And right at the base of the aorta are the coronary arteries. And they sort of come along and are along the outside of the heart. As I pump around, as I pass around that heart, you could see some of these coronary arteries that are on the outside of this ventricle. And they're actually feeding the heart muscle itself with the oxygen that it needs, because it needs a constant supply of oxygen. When you hear about a person having a heart attack, it's often because there's a blockage in these coronary arteries. When a person gets a heart bypass surgery, they're going around a blockage in these coronary arteries. Obviously, if we restrict the flow of blood to the heart itself, it can't function properly. And then a person can't survive if their heart's not functioning properly. I'm sure you've been to the doctor and had your blood pressure measured. Okay, I can't even say it usually. Using a sphygmomanometer. And they put a cuff on your arm.
That's what it's called?
Wait, did
Yeah.
you say it right?
I think I did.
I think so.
Now you made me say it wrong.
Sphygmomanometer.
Sphygmomanometer.
Man,
It seems like there's an extra syllable in there, but it is correct. Sphygmomanometer.
Wait, can you write that out?
It's right there.
Sphygmomanometer.
Oh wait, is it
All right, anyway. So guys, enough.
Wait, is it still
When you get your
recording?
blood pressure, what they do, they put the cuff around your arm. They pump in, so what you'll notice is the person taking your blood pressure also then puts a stethoscope on your arm, and they're listening for your heartbeat. They pump up that cuff until they can't hear your heart beating anymore. And what that means is the pressure in the cuff is equal to the pressure in your arteries, and they're not moving anymore. They're basically cutting off blood flow to your hand. and they take note of what pressure it is. So they see, when does the pressure of the cuff equal the pressure in the artery as the heart is beating? And that's the top number. Okay, that's called systole. That's the pressure when your heart is contracting and forcing blood into your arteries. That's the higher number, because obviously there's greater pressure as your heart forces that blood into the arteries. Once the ventricles relax and contract, the pressure in the arteries drops significantly. And that's the second number in your blood pressure. It's called diastole. And the way they listen for that is, so they pump it up, they listen, they watch the pressure when they can't hear your heart anymore. And then what do? They release it slowly. And as they release the pressure on that cuff, eventually they can hear your heart again, okay? Because the pressure is now equal to that of your resting when your ventricles are relaxed, and that's the second number. So the second number is always smaller. So when we say your blood pressure is 120/70, it's 120 millimeters of mercury is what the units are. When your ventricles are contracting, and 70 when they're relaxing. Sophia?
So high blood pressure, which is bad, you have to pump your arm up really
Yeah,
high.
they would have to, yes. They'd have to, you have higher pressure in your arteries, and that could be to narrowing of the arteries, or various other conditions or blockages
Okay.
that increase the pressure every time your heart beats, the pressure in those arteries.
And if you're healthy, it doesn't take much.
Yes, takes less. Our heartbeat or our heart rate, our pulse rate, is controlled by special parts of our heart. Okay, and you know it's sometimes called a pacemaker, our heart's natural pacemaker. There's other terms for it. It's really the SA node and the AV node are the proper terms for these patches that are in our heart muscle. Okay, I don't have it up here, but the SA node, it's sort of around the right atrium. And this is a little patch of cells that generates the electrical impulses that tell the chambers of your heart when to contract and when to relax. Okay? And normally that functions, and I'll show you a picture in a minute, to coordinate all the pumping of the heart. So it establishes our heartbeat. Oh yeah, it's in the right wall of the right atrium. Okay? And then there's another node that's between the atrium and the ventricle. It's also controlled by nerves that increase or decrease our heart rate. Can be measured with an EKG. If you ever see, like on movies when they have a little heartbeat monitor, that's an EKG, and it shows the different phases of a heart beating. Okay, it shows the contraction of the atria, it shows the relaxation, it shows the contracting of the ventricles. By looking at the pattern of those electrical impulses, they can tell whether you have a healthy heart or not. So this is what an EKG typically looks like. You have a little blip there. This is the SA node. Okay, again, that's up in the right atrium. That's the first part. That initiates a heartbeat. And it happens at regular intervals, once every second or so, it depends. Okay? Then a signal travels down to the AV node. It also travels out to so this controls both sides of the heart, this SA node. Then it travels to the AV node, and it kind of pauses for a minute, because there has to be a gap between when the atrium contracts and when the ventricle contracts. If they're both contract at the same time, there would be the backflow of blood, because those valves are open. Okay? The atrium wouldn't fully fill with blood, and so that would be a problem. So the atrium contracts, there's a slight pause, the atrium relaxes, the ventricle contracts. It has to happen in that proper order. And it happens through impulses that are transported through these various fibers. Sometimes a person's SA node or other parts of that electrical system don't function properly, and they may have an irregular heartbeat, and they could have a transplant of a pacemaker put in. And a pacemaker is just basically a little piece of equipment they transplant into the heart that tells the heart when to beat. Basically takes the place of that SA node and establishes a regular heart rhythm. Okay, and again, same kind of idea here. You see the SA node up here, passes to the left atrium as well. then it gets the AV node, and then through the rest of the heart tissue, causing it to contract. So it has to happen in that regular pattern. All right, so you are going to have to know the parts of the heart and the arteries and veins that surround them.
Why?
It's really, I mean, it looks complicated. It really is not very complicated. It's actually pretty self-evident, I think, once you think about what's going on in the heart. So, you know, if you start off with the chambers of the heart, you know, they're reversed when you're looking at them. Okay, when we look at a diagram of a heart, okay, the right atrium is on the left side of a diagram, and that's because you're imagining that is inside of somebody's body and you're looking at them. If that's my heart and you're looking at me, it's in my body. My right atrium is on this side, even though as you look at me, it's on your left, it's my right. So the same is true in the heart. It's the right side of my heart, so it's on that side. So the right atrium receives blood. The vein, this is the major vein of our body, which funnels all of the blood that has to return to our heart, is the Vena Cava. Okay, there's two parts. The superior Vena Cava, which brings the blood from the upper parts of the body down into the right atrium, and the inferior Vena Cava, which funnels all the blood from the lower parts of the body into the right atrium. That collects all the blood, bringing it back to the heart. Then, from the right atrium, pumps into the right ventricle, goes through that tricuspid valve. And since this blood came from all the various parts of the body, it's given up its oxygen, it's high in carbon dioxide, and so it needs to get its way back to the lungs. And that's where it's headed. After the right ventricle pumps, it pumps that blood through the pulmonary valve, and it goes through a pulmonary artery heading to the lungs. One branch leads to the left lung, the other branch leads to the right lung. And that blood gets to our lungs, gets reoxygenated, gives up the carbon dioxide that we exhale, and then that blood has to come back to the heart, but this time it comes to the opposite side. Okay, that blood from our lungs comes back into the heart, into the left atrium. Okay. Comes through these veins, they're called the pulmonary veins. There's two that come from the left lung, there's two that come from the right lung, and that blood collects in the left atrium now. Goes through the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve to the left ventricle. Once it gets pumped out, goes through the aortic valve, through the aorta. And this aorta branches off and leads to all the different parts of their body. You know, right off of the top are the branches, they're not shown here, that feed our heart muscle itself, the coronary arteries. Okay? Then we have these branches up here, go to the head, and the torso, and the arms. The aorta loops around, it goes behind the heart, and heads down, and that brings all the blood to the lower parts of the body. Okay? And those are the various parts of the heart. You see it here? We call the circuit that's giving blood to the lungs and back to the heart the pulmonary circuit, and we call the rest of it the systemic circulation that brings it to the rest of our body systems. Are any questions about that? Let's hold off on blood vessels for today. We'll talk about the blood vessels tomorrow. But the heart is good enough.